Chair lays out HB 2652 and recognizes Representative Larson to explain his bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 2652 creates an advisory board to study surface water and groundwater interaction, consisting of appointees representing the Water Development Board, TCEQ, river authorities, groundwater districts, academia, the House Chair of the Natural Resources Committee, and the Chair of the Senate Water and Rural Affairs Committee, and the Office of the Governor. The creation of an advisory board will provide a forum for meaningful study and development of policy solutions to guide the legislature forward on this issue. This is a very complicated issue, very contentious, and I bring this forward for a couple of reasons. The state of Texas has spent tens of millions of dollars in a lawsuit against the state of New Mexico, and it's addressing this issue, conjunctive use of water. What the state engineer of New Mexico did was allowed 3,000 permits along the Rio Grande to farmers. As they drilled into the groundwater, they were supplanting the water that was flowing into the river. And at the end of the river, or through this process, they were able to dilute the amount of water that was available for the folks in El Paso with the reservoir Elephant Butte. It's funny that we're spending literally tens of millions of dollars fighting a state adjacent to us, and we don't recognize this in our own state law. And so this brings it forward to stop the hypocrisy. We need to address this. We had a series of hearings over the last decade on this committee to go out and look at different areas that are impacted. So farmers or operators put in wells, and then we see that in the adjacent basin that we have less water available. There was a study done by the Southwest Research folks to show that there's 30% of the water at the surface water is groundwater. And that was a snapshot study. We think it's probably much more profound than that. In the Devil's River, the same thing. Groundwater pumping reduces the amount of water that's available. San Saba, we went to Mason and we went to Brady, and we talked to folks that were impacted there. You had pecan farmers, you had folks growing hay. They turned on the pumps, the river dried up. And so somewhere we got to get to this position. In the hill country, we see it as wells are put in, the springs dry up, the creeks dry up, and then all that water that's supposed to flow to the tributaries into these basins, it's not available. And so we have two different regulatory frameworks, one for groundwater, one for surface water. I think sometime this bill would start the discussion. By no means do I think it's going to be an easy process, because people have dug in on how we deal with groundwater and how we deal with surface water. Long-term impacts, we see the next significant drought. This is where all the litigation is going to be based. And so we can preempt it by addressing the issue, by having a discussion, have all the stakeholders at the table, and develop a process to have a single regulatory process for all of water in Texas instead of having the two. And I can feel the hair rising on the back of the necks and the people that are sitting behind me because it's a very difficult issue. We're spending, if it's good enough for us in the Supreme Court of the United States, it should be good enough for the legislature to address the very difficult issue. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll answer any questions.
Mr. Chairman, or Representative Larson, do you have a substitute?
We do.
Okay. The chair offers a committee substitute and recognize Representative Larson to explain that. Yeah,
the committee substitute simply adds 3 new members. The board consisted of 9 on the original bill. It goes to 12. We got a couple on the river authorities. We got a couple, instead of 1, we go 2 on the river authorities. Instead of 1, we go to 2 on the groundwater districts, and we have folks that represent the environmental community would also be put on it. And those are the 3 additional folks.
Thank you, Representative Larson. Members, any questions? Representative Paul.
Yeah, Representative Larson, does the governor appoint these other ones? I mean, you mentioned the chairman of the committee in the House and Senate, but the others are appointed by the governor?
Yes, the office of the governor has also an appointee.
Then this board, this is something that's going to be a permanent structure that would come over there, and but it's a permanent thing, but its process, its charge will be just to evaluate this situation. No control over anybody else, but it's an evaluation of what this problem that you've identified is.
You know, that's one thing I really like about you, Representative Paul, your optimism. I like that. And yes, it would just start a conversation. And we get all of the folks, hopefully all the stakeholders and all of the folks from the state regulatory agencies sit down and start having this discussion.
And then the study that you mentioned about evaluating what this would be gone, does this, I guess you're not providing monies for these studies, is it? But is this something that they're going to be trying to get that data?
The folks with the Water Development Board and TCQ have indicated that they can do it with existing staff. The issue of what it would cost us to get outside resources to start doing the analysis is about $300,000. And so there will be a fiscal note attached to this. They're going to have hydrologists involved. We're going to have to start studying the basins, where the inflows and the alluviums in the aquifers, you know, the interaction between ground and surface water. Like I said, this is forward thinking. It's an issue that we're sitting in the Supreme Court arguing to a state adjacent to us, but we don't recognize it in state law. We have to address this because this will be the genesis of so many lawsuits if we don't preempt it. You know, people are going to start suing their neighbors. They put a pump in, their spring dries up, or there's a disruption. And this will happen in the next drought, which we might be in right now. We're in an extensive drought across the state right now, and you're going to start seeing springs dry up. People are going to start pointing fingers. And I hope that the state has the fortitude to step up and look at this and be forward thinking instead of being reactive.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Paul. Members, any further questions of Representative Larson? If not, we will proceed to public testimony.
Okay, reserve the right to close.
Thank you. You shall have it. Chair calls Andrew Weir. Please state your name correctly for the record, who you represent, and your position on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members. My name is Andrew Weir. I'm a citizen in Bastrop County, and I'm here representing myself and the organization Simsboro Aquifer Water Defense Foundation, SAWDF. As Representative Larson fondly called us, sawdust. So we are testifying in support of this bill because the more information we have about surface water, groundwater interaction, the better. SAWDF works with business, government, and the Groundwater Conservation Districts in Milam, Burleson, Lee, and Bastrop counties, representing landowners who have 3,500 exempt domestic livestock or irrigation wells. And we're situated between the Brazos and the Colorado rivers. And so we know about the surface water and groundwater interaction, and we need to be a part of that solution. So we would like to encourage the favorable passage of this bill. And we'd also like to offer our services because of where we are located and because we interact with landowners and the public. We can help this committee to hold a public hearing. That's part of the substitute bill, that they would have at least one public hearing, and we would offer our services to help to convene that and gather people, because you have that interaction between groundwater, surface water with those two river basins and our proximity to Austin. So with that, I answer any questions.
Any questions, members? Thank you, Mr. Weir. Appreciate you being here. Chair calls Steve Box. Mr. Box, please state your name for the record, who you represent, and your position on the bill, please.
Yes, thank you, Chairman and Representative Larson and committee members. I am Steve Box, President of Environmental Stewardship. Environmental Stewardship has filed comments and is for the substitute bill to establish an advisory board to study surface water and groundwater interactions. For reasons discussed below, we would recommend that the person representing environmental interests be familiar with the objectives of Environmental Flow Bill, Senate Bill 3, that passed the 80th legislature. We further urge that the legislature, not in this bill particularly, provide funding for such studies as are needed in the state to assist groundwater management areas and groundwater conservation districts. First, it's a pleasure to be able to once again provide testimony to this committee, and especially gratifying to be in agreement with Representative Larson on the need for an advisory board. As Environmental Stewardship's chief advocate for the protection of our state water resources, I have testified before this committee in years past as we started down a now 13-year journey to craft groundwater and surface water legislation, and then to participate in the enactment of that legislation in Bastrop and surrounding counties, Milam, Burleson, Lee. Most recently, I have been a stakeholder in the activities of the actions of Groundwater Management Area 12, as we have reviewed the desired future conditions for the Carrizo-Wilcox aquifer group that includes the highly targeted Simsboro aquifer formation. GMA 12, and like many other groundwater management areas in the state, is desperately in need and is ready for state funding to enable it to do the science needed to better understand, and more importantly, to measure and quantify the relationship between surface waters and groundwaters under its jurisdiction. Once this advisory board is established, I look forward to sharing our experience as a stakeholder to GMA 12 with the board in the hopes that the board will see the wisdom in closing the gap between environmental flow legislation under Senate Bill 3 and groundwater legislation, making it clear to both groundwater districts and river authorities that the protection of environmental flows is a key link to providing for a sound ecological aquatic environment called for in Senate Bill 3. And I will also echo Representative Larson's interests and concerns with the fact that we, as the state of Texas, are in conflict and in the Supreme Court with the state of New Mexico on an issue that we have not yet resolved and faced here in the state of Texas. And I think it is encouraging to hear that there is thought that we might try to reconcile these and bring them together. Finally, to do this work, it is our view that the Basin and Bay Area Stakeholder Committees, the BBASCs, need to be tasked with and funded to provide recommendations to the legislature, TCEQ, and Texas Water Development Board regarding the appropriate means of monitoring the impact of groundwater production on rivers and their tributaries in order to protect environmental flows, especially during drought conditions. Drought conditions is one of the things that seems to be lacking in groundwater regulations. In addition, the BBASCs need funding to task their Bay and Basin area expert science teams to make scientifically based recommendations to that committee so that that committee can then make scientifically based and also the political actions that they have within the BBASC to the state. With that, I will close. I urge passage of this, and I will be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Box. Members, any questions? Appreciate you coming this morning.
Thank you.
Chair calls Carlos Rubenstein. Please state your name for the record, who you represent, and your position on the bill. Mr. Rubenstein.
Chairman, members of the committee, for the record, my name is Carlos Rubenstein. I'm principal of RSH2, and I'm here to testify for House Bill 2652. As you've heard this morning already, there has for quite some time, and perhaps far too long, been a recognized need for improvement in the science and understanding to evaluate surface water, groundwater interactions. From a statewide perspective, the proper management of surface water, groundwater interactions is important in regard to water rights along the river, Endangered Species Act compliance, environmental flows consideration, groundwater permitting, and obtaining bed and banks permits. We see groundwater, surface water interaction conflicts in the Rio Grande, Texas versus New Mexico case, on the San Saba, on the Colorado, along the Brazos, and in iconic and threatened Texas water features such as Jacob's Well and Comanche Springs. We have and will see them elsewhere in Texas. Central to this discussion is the question, do we have the right science and understanding to properly quantify these impacts? To be sure, surface water, groundwater interaction issues have been studied in the past, but a review of findings indicates significantly different results. An honest and open discussion is needed to advance towards resolution on this matter. Texas Water Trades, some GCDs, and EDF, among many others, are hard at work on this issue and can serve as a great resource in this much needed effort. Currently, I'm also assisting Belding Farms in assessing these issues. Impacts to Comanche Springs from nearby groundwater pumping are among the key points under review. For all the reasons I have stated, I am pleased to also report that Belding Farms and Cockrell Investment Partners support House Bill 2652. Again, thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Rubenstein. Rubenstein, I'm sorry. Any questions? Thank you, sir. Representative Bowers, did you have a question? I'm sorry.
I did not.
Okay, I'm so sorry.
I think it was declared.
Okay.
Is that mic on?
No, it's not.
Well, thank you for recognizing me.
Well, we thank you for being here.
I feel like I'm way over.
It's Vanessa Puig-Williams.
Chair calls Vanessa Puig-Williams. Please state your name for the record, who you represent, and your position on the bill.
Did it not work?
No, I haven't done it yet.
Hi, good morning. My name is Vanessa Puig-Williams, and I'm director of the Texas Water Program for the Environmental Defense Fund. And I'm testifying today in support of House Bill 2652. And we appreciate, Representative Larson, your efforts on this important issue. EDF's work in Texas is focused on ensuring that our water supplies, our communities, and ecosystems who depend on these water supplies are resilient to drought. I don't need to tell any of you or anyone really in the state of Texas how vital both economically and ecologically rivers are to this state. We all know this, but what is not so obvious is how vital groundwater is to the flow of rivers in Texas. The Water Development Board estimates that 30% of the water flowing in rivers across Texas originates as groundwater. And during times of drought, virtually all of the water flowing in rivers is groundwater. Despite these hydrological connections, groundwater and surface water are managed separately in Texas. And Texas's framework for managing groundwater allows groundwater levels to decline over time. Even, as Representative Larson explained, when these declines in groundwater levels allow water in our rivers and springs to decrease. Across Texas, the flow of rivers is increasingly impacted by groundwater pumping. This adversely affects landowners' property interests in the groundwater they own and place, and it also impacts the public's interest in surface water, which the state holds in trust. This is an urgent issue that must be addressed. In the future, as parts of Texas become more arid, it is imperative that we have a framework in place to ensure that groundwater is managed to sustain springs and rivers. But I want to point out that we are in a good place. We have a good start in Texas. Chapter 36 of the Water Code requires groundwater conservation districts to consider impacts to surface water resources when evaluating permits or adopting desired future conditions. And groundwater conservation districts have the authority to regulate groundwater production to prevent the reduction of artesian pressure, which is essentially the pressure in an aquifer that keeps springs flowing to the surface. However, many groundwater conservation districts are unable to fully consider or address impacts to surface water caused by groundwater pumping. And a major reason for this is the lack of site-specific data and refined modeling that they need to understand the highly local and complex interactions between groundwater and surface water, and then how to manage to protect these connections. So we need to take a hard look at how we can ensure that groundwater districts have the resources, the tools, and the science to manage groundwater to ensure that springs and rivers continue to flow, and that the considerations Chapter 36 envisions become real considerations. House Bill 2652 is a great first step in getting us there, and we would urge your support. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Members, any questions? Appreciate your testimony.
That's it. Or can I jump to the
All
next
right.
one?
No further.
Anyone else wishing to testify?
Is there anyone else wishing to testify on for or against HB 2652? If not, Chair recognizes Representative Larson to close on his bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very complex issue, one that the state of Texas needs to address. With that, I close.
Just a quick question, Representative Larson. You mentioned two things. You mentioned the lawsuit, and familiar with that in my other capacity because we're having to put some money into that lawsuit with New Mexico, and obviously we've expended enormous amount of resources on that lawsuit. Is that your understanding as well?
It is. I think the last recollection I have is over 15 million, and then we keep asking for 5 million
Right.
Just about every session. And it's in front of an intermediary right now. I think a referee's been assigned out of New Orleans to try to address the issue. We'll win. You know, we're going to win the lawsuit. All the indications are. But the reality is it's hypocritical, the state of Texas, when we don't recognize conjunctive use. And that's the whole premise of this lawsuit.
Right, and then that leads me to the complexity of this issue, the groundwater versus surface water, and in our region, obviously, we have so much growth and development. You guys hear this all the time: the differences between unincorporated Harris County and incorporated Houston, and obviously, the city of Houston has its water source. Surface water. They're building a new North Houston treatment plant, I think.
Sure.
But you also have those, and that's 2 million people. The other 2 million people in unincorporated Harris County either live in the mud or in IOU, or they're on water wells and septic tanks, right? And so even within Harris County, there are just different ways of providing water. And I guess you would, your bill, your regime would help us kind of tackle some of these issues that are starting to boil up. Is that your understanding too?
That's the focus, is just have a comprehensive regulatory approach, both ground and surface water, because we disconnect them right now. We have no relationship in the regulatory framework right now of surface water and what the groundwater impacts are. And it's myopic, and I think that it's going to haunt us if we don't get a handle on it. And the next drought will be will show profound reasoning of why we need to address this issue now.
Thank you, Representative Larson. Any further questions? Hearing none. Thank you, Representative Larson.
I appreciate it.
Let's see, if there's no objection, to chair withdraws the committee substitute. If there's no objection, the bill will be left pending. Chair hears none, the bill will be left pending. Thank you. Also, Chair recognizes Representative Cody Harris is present. Apologize after, you've been here long time. Chair recognizes, Chair lays out HB 3619 and recognizes Representative Bowers to explain her bill.
Good morning again, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Vice Chair Harris and members for allowing me to lay out House Bill 3619 today. Water is precious and water is life, and we grow to appreciate it more when we don't have access to it or to clean water. House Bill 3619 protects Texans' property rights in groundwater by amending Section 36.113, subsection D2 of the Water Code, which specifies the considerations a district must make when evaluating whether to grant or deny a permit. Currently, under 36.113 D2, when evaluating whether to grant or deny a permit, a groundwater conservation district must consider whether the proposed use of water will unreasonably affect groundwater and surface water resources and existing permit holders. However, Chapter 36 does not require a groundwater conservation district to also consider whether exempt wells will be impacted by a proposed permit. Chapter 36 defines an exempt well as a well that is used solely for domestic use or for providing water for livestock or poultry. If the well is located on a tract of land larger than 10 acres and is incapable of producing more than 25,000 gallons of groundwater per day. This is essentially a rural well that landowners across the state depend on for basic needs, and right now, groundwater conservation districts are not required to consider whether these wells will be impacted by a proposed permit. To address this oversight, House Bill 3619 adds unreasonable impacts to registered exempt wells to the list of considerations a GCD must make before granting a permit. This was a TWCA consensus bill in 2017, filed by Chairman King, and then picked up again last session in House Bill 726 by Representative Larson. It received unanimous support at TWCA back in 2017, which I must say, as a sophomore, it gives me great pride to pick up this legislation again. I believe I have a few people here to testify, and I would like to reserve the right to close.
Thank you, Representative Bowers. Members, any questions? Thank you. If there are no questions, we'll proceed to public testimony. Chair calls Andrew Weir. Please state your name for the record, who you represent, and your position on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, my name is Andrew Weir, and I own land in rural Bastrop County. I have a domestic water well in the Simsboro formation of the Carrizo-Wilcox Aquifer. I'm speaking to you representing myself and as a director for the Simsboro Aquifer Water Defense Fund. And SAWDF works with landowners in Milam, Burleson, Lee, and Bastrop counties. These landowners represent Texans who maintain their groundwater rights by either keeping it in the ground or bringing it to the surface in more than 3,500 domestic livestock or irrigation wells, exempt wells, as Representative Bowers pointed out. These landowner properties that are served by these wells with no other source of water, these landowner properties represent more than $5 billion in taxable value, and that's after you take out agricultural exemptions. That's what is invested by exempt water well owners in just these 4 counties. 4 counties. I want to emphasize this point because collectively, exempt well owners have more invested in groundwater than permit holders, including the massive permit project Vista Ridge, which has its source right in Burleson County, sending water to San Antonio. And that, Representative Larson will correct me on the figure, but it's like $3 billion for that project. And you have, in these exempt well owners, $5 billion worth of value with agricultural exemptions. It's more at market value. So these communities are really invested in their groundwater. Representative Bowers has laid out the fact that the current statute, the current section, does not acknowledge property rights. And I want to go back to just the beautiful language that established groundwater districts. I'm paraphrasing, but it says essentially groundwater conservation districts are the state's preferred method of groundwater management in order to protect property rights and balance the conservation of development, balance conservation and the development of groundwater to meet the state's needs. So you see in the current section, the current considerations that they're looking at surface water, groundwater, existing resources, or permit holders. And that's a singular duty. Now, groundwater conservations have 2 duties: protect groundwater rights, property rights, and then balance conservation and development. Well, that current statute only addresses development, which would be permit holders, and conservation, surface and groundwater resources, existing resources. So we need to bring in that second duty. This is the critical decision-making process that groundwater districts enter into. They have a statutory duty to protect property rights. It should be part of that decision-making process. And it brings them on par by including exempt wells. It gives us parity with permit holders. As exempt well owners, and what we have invested in our groundwater needs to have parity with permit holders. And I've laid out, we have that economic value. Representative Bowers pointed out this was a consensus bill in 2017. Chairman King had presented it at that time. Last year, Representative Larson presented similar language, and it unfortunately got bogged down in the Senate at the end of the session. 3rd time's the charm, right? That's the expression. That's where we're at. I know there is wide bipartisan support for this bill. My own Representative John Cyrier is considered filing it, but Representative Bowers beat him to the punch, okay? I know in the Senate, Senator Sarah Eckert introduced the exact same language in Senate Bill 946, and it's supported by Senator Louis Kolkhorst. And so you've got bipartisan support, and both of them are on the Water, Agricultural, and Rural Affairs Committee. So you've got momentum. You've got history that says this bill's time has come. It's time to give parity and include exempt well owners in the water code. And for groundwater districts to be empowered is the way I would address it. I attend my groundwater conservation district every month. I attend the neighboring groundwater conservation district also, and to the groundwater management area planning meetings. And in those meetings, the one thing I hear consistently, either from general managers or from board members, is that and I had this told to me last February by a general manager. He said, we would love to consider exempt wells, but it's not in the code. That's what I was told. So you can empower them and legally require them to consider exempt well owners with this legislation, and I urge you to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weir. Members, any questions? Thank you, appreciate you. Chair calls Gregory Ellis. Mr. Ellis, state your name for the record, who you represent, your position on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members. I'm Greg Ellis. I'm here on behalf of a number of Groundwater Conservation District clients across the state of Texas. I'm here speaking in support of the bill. I would like to point out a couple things real quickly, just to make sure we know what the bill does and doesn't do. For one thing, it does not require a district to regulate to the shallowest well on the system. It simply requires us to consider the impact on exempt use wells, as opposed to saying we have to protect them under all circumstances. There are times when somebody who owns a shallow well needs to drill a deeper well. The solution to their problem is drilling a deeper well. At the same time, we're not opening the door or allowing any exempt use well owner to have standing to file a protest. Most of the districts out there, and I believe all of my clients, have provisions that allow exempt use well owners who have registered wells to be able to protest an application, but only if it's within a certain distance where it might be directly impacted by the proposed permit. With that, I think we do need to be able to consider the impact on exempt use wells. I would ask for an amendment that we add the word registered before exempt, because obviously we can't protect wells we don't know about. So if the well's not registered with the district, then we have no way of knowing they're there. And we have had a problem in the past where the district rules didn't say registered, and suddenly a well owner that nobody knew about popped up and tried to interfere with an application. This would also encourage all well owners to register with the district, which is important for a couple reasons. One is any additional applications coming in to file new wells, but also when TCEQ has a contamination event, they will contact the local groundwater conservation district and say there's a contamination, there's potential groundwater contamination. Who do we need to contact? Well, the only list we can give them is the list of wells we know about. So if someone has not registered a well that we don't know about it, there's no way to contact them to let them know there may be a contamination plume in the area. And with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ellis. Members, any questions?
Thank you.
Thank you. Chair calls Judith McGeary. State your name for the record, who you represent, your position on the bill.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Judith McGarry. I am here representing the Farm and Ranch Freedom Alliance and myself in support of the bill. I'll make just a couple of quick points. In addition to the individual investment in exempt wells, it's important to recognize that these are basically serving the function of public utility infrastructure. If we don't protect exempt wells, the other option is somehow we have to get water to these folks. And how do we do that? We have pipes, we have, huge expense put into that system. So by addressing the concerns of exempt wells, we are not only protecting the individual's property rights, but we are protecting the overall community and its infrastructure. I'd also like to respectfully disagree with what was just said about registered wells being required. I think it's important and support efforts to encourage people to register their wells for all the reasons that were just said. But I don't think it's appropriate to basically penalize someone if, for instance, they have an older well, they don't know about registration, whatever the reason is. If the district hasn't managed to reach out to all the well owners and convince them that it's in their best interest to register, as I think it is, and for the reasons laid out, they shouldn't somehow be penalized that then if a permit applicant comes in and they are concerned that it will directly impact their water source, that somehow they're cut out of the discussions at that time. So I'd ask that you leave the bill as it's currently written. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Members, any questions? Appreciate your testimony.
Thank you.
Chair calls Vanessa Puig Williams. Please state your name for the record, who you represent, and your position on the bill, please.
Hello, my name is Vanessa Puig Williams, and I'm director of the Texas Water Program for Environmental Defense Fund, and I am testifying in support of House Bill 3619. EDF supports House Bill 3619 because it protects rural landowners' property rights and ensures that groundwater is managed to protect all users. As Representative Bowers mentioned, currently groundwater districts are not required to consider how exempt wells will be impacted by proposed permits. Across Texas, there are rural landowners who depend on these exempt wells for their domestic and livestock for water supply to survive. Often, when there is a large permit request, it is these smaller rural wells that are threatened the most. At EDF, I have the privilege of working with many landowners who recognize the importance of conserving groundwater resources and recognize the important role that groundwater districts have in safeguarding and protecting landowners' property rights. As groundwater levels continue to decline across the state, it is increasingly important that groundwater districts consider how smaller rural wells will be impacted by permit requests. Many groundwater districts are already making these considerations, as Greg Ellis pointed out, and are working to protect the rights of these rural well owners. And Chapter 36 certainly provides districts with the authority to do so, but House Bill 3619 makes clear that this consideration would be a requirement. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Chair calls Linda K. Rogers. Thank you.
Did not testify.
So Linda K. Rogers
Did not testify.
did not testify.
No, anyone else wishing to testify?
All right. Is there anyone else wishing to testify on, for, or against HB 3619? If not, the chair recognizes Representative Bowers to close on her bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am thankful for everyone that came to testify in support of this bill and this legislation today. I'm also thankful for the work of my colleagues that have worked on this in previous sessions and interims before my time. I want to thank Mr. Weir and just for saying that this bill's time has come, and let's hope that the third time is the charm. Mr. Ellis, I want to thank you for your comments as well, and those of others. And I want to address, I guess, the part about adding the word registered. We are discussing with stakeholders currently about amending the language, but we welcome any further discussion. So please come and see me in my office and staff. We believe that one positive result of HB 3619 could be to encourage, and I like that the last person or one of the persons that came up and supported the bill used the word encourage, but it would encourage more landowners to register their rural wells with Groundwater Conservation Districts so that they can ensure the district considers how these wells will be impacted by a proposed permit. Members, House Bill 3619 will protect landowners' property rights in groundwater and helps fulfill Groundwater Conservation District's authority to protect property rights as required by Chapter 36 of the Water Code. And with that, I reserve the right to close.
You close.
Did I? So did I close twice?
You close. You don't want to reserve the right to close.
I do. I want to close.
You close. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative
I
Bowers.
just got going. Forgive me.
It's okay. If there's no objection, the bill will be left pending. The chair hears none. The bill is left pending. So, Chair Wally will relinquish his duties to Vice Chair Cody Harris to chair the remaining bills. Vice Chair.